Hi, I'm Becky Murray. This is the final session of the 8-part series on embracing the journey. You know, life is such a gift. We're handcrafted by God himself and his fingerprints are all over our DNA. But sadly, we don't always see this. Circumstances and situations can sometimes cloud our judgment, and it turns our beautiful coloured world into dull greys. So in this final part with you, I want to focus on what I believe to be the biggest key on embracing your journey, and that's having a hunger for more. In 2005, I had the honour of spending 3 months in Mozambique. I was there at a mission school, and it was an incredible time that really helped shape my life and make me part of who I am. But there was this one standout moment that has never left me all these years later. I was in a Sunday morning church service and I'd volunteered to help distribute communion bread. I'd done this dozens of times before, except the problem was I'd only ever done this in my home church in England. I'd never before given out communion in a desperately poor area where there was literally starving people. I had this little tiny plate in my hand with all the tiny pieces of bread, and as soon as I got close to the people, they literally lunged at me and took huge handfuls of the bread. The pastor actually spoke up on the microphone telling me they were not allowed to do that. They're all going to be fed a meal after the meeting. This is communion. It's holy. We have to teach the difference between having a meal and taking a communion. I understood this, but I stood there numb, looking at my empty communion plate, and I was only on the first row. I awkwardly took the empty plate back to the front and apologised to the pastor. But as soon as I could, I discreetly slipped out and ran back to my home there and just sobbed. You see, in that moment, I saw the very issue of my own heart. Here I was in life, content to take a tiny breadcrumb. And that morning, I witnessed for the first time what it looked like for hungry people to take a hold of bread. See, are we happy to eat the breadcrumbs from the floor instead of dining at the feast that God lays before us, not just in eternity, but here and now in this life too? So often we settle for a tiny breadcrumb to satisfy us, and we settle on our journeys too. We settle for good lives when God had an abundant life in store for us. So in this final session together, we'll look at how you hunger for more and not settle for good enough. So firstly, you have to keep your vision fresh. There's nothing worse than meeting people who think they've arrived in life. The truth is, we're constantly on a journey, and until the day we die, we're still on a journey. We're on a journey of education where we never stop learning. You know, some of my favourite people are the people who constantly have their heads in a book, and they're constantly learning. You know, we're on a journey of surrender where every single day we're learning what it really is to say yes to God in the big things and also in the little daily things. We're on a journey of being transformed from glory to glory until eventually we start to look more like Christ. But the problem is, if you lose your vision for the future, you end up returning to the past. The children of Israel often did this, and there's a classic scripture in Numbers 11, verse 15, where all of a sudden the children of Israel started remembering slavery like it was this joyous, wonderful time. And so they've been in the wilderness for a while, and in Numbers 11, verse 5, it says, "We remember the fish that we ate freely in Egypt, the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, and the garlic. But now our whole being is being dried up. There's nothing except all this manna before our eyes." Wow, how our emotions can deceive us. They were hungry, and yet God fed them miraculously. But they were tired of eating all this miraculous manna. They'd lost their wonder of God. You see, they were in the wilderness. There wasn't just the supermarkets around the corner. They couldn't just grow the vegetation. And so every single day they woke up and manna was laid before them for them to collect. They could eat their heart's content. They never went hungry. They never went without because God continually provided. And yet they lost their wonder of God. They lost how incredible, miraculous this manna was. And suddenly they're remembering slavery like it was this incredible banquet for them. And they're tired with all this miraculous manna. How many of us lose our wonder and sometimes become ungrateful with life? Psalm 40, verse 5 says this: Many, Lord, are your wonders that you have done. The things you have planned for us, none can compare. If I were to speak and tell of your deeds, there would be too many to declare. But if we would fix our eyes on him, on his goodness, on his mercy, on his love that never fails, when we focus our gaze towards him, the wonder starts to stir up once again in our hearts, replacing the fear, replacing the sorrow, replacing shame. It's this hunger for his presence that needs to consume us once again. You see, you can't have an Egyptian mindset in Canaan. The Israelites had left Egypt. They'd come out of Egypt physically years before, but their minds were still dominated by Egypt, and it slowed them down from reaching their destiny. The key is you can take luggage on a journey, but you should never take baggage. A few years ago, I was doing another short-term missions trip, and we were doing all these clothing campaigns, taking clothes to these remote villages. And I'd been there once before in this region and seen children running around, and they hardly had anything. They hardly had any clothes. And so I was determined I was going to take as many clothes as I could to give out in the village. So I'd got all the team members to take loads of clothes, and then I got just way too much, basically. My case was overloaded. Like, I consider myself fairly strong, but there's no way I could move this bag. It was way overweight. And so we arrive at Gatwick Airport just before we're about to fly. For whatever reason, I don't know why we didn't take the lifts up to the departure lounge, but for whatever reason, we went on the escalators. And so everyone's going up the escalators, and I come to get on, and I got on, and as I pulled my case, I just didn't quite pull it hard enough because it was so heavy. And so as it came on the bottom of the escalator, it was fine initially, but as soon as it started going up where it turns into the stairs, all of a sudden my case was kind of wobbling between these two steps. So I leaned to pull my bag, but as I leaned, I ended up falling onto the bag. Well, it went from bad to worse. I am laid out on this escalator. One of my shoes had fell onto the escalator coming down the opposite way. There's all these people on the escalator coming down, watching me going up, and they're just staring at me like, what is she doing? My hair is getting sucked up the side. It was just a mess. Mercifully, there was someone on the team who was strong. They grabbed a hold of me, because by this point, the more it's going up, the more vertical it's becoming, and I couldn't get up for laughing. And so mercifully, this guy had pulled me up back to my feet, and I managed to carry on with the trip without too many cuts and bruises. And to this day, when I'm getting on and off an escalator, I have to focus. I have to concentrate of how to get on an escalator. But the truth is, sometimes we hold ourselves back. We have so much heavy baggage, and rather than leaving it at the cross where we're supposed to leave it, we end up carrying it through our lives with us, taking it on the journey. And all it ever does is slow us down, and eventually it can make us fall too. You see, if you don't let go of the baggage, it'll end up being the thing that holds you. Think of the things that sometimes we carry in our hearts that we shouldn't. The hurts, the disappointments, the times we've chewed over the moments where we've been wronged, and we chew over it probably longer than we maybe should. If we keep carrying this, it'll lead into unforgiveness, and that is an unmanageable and deadly weight to have to carry. Maybe you're carrying offense. You know, Proverbs 18 verse 19 says that a brother offended is harder to be won than a strong city. Their contentions are like the bars of a castle. All offense really does is fence off the offended person, isolating them away. Or maybe today you're carrying a defeated spirit. You've given up on the journey because life's just not gone how you hoped it would and how you thought it should. Maybe you're simply tired and worn out with all the baggage you've been carrying through life. Well, if that's you, then take heart, because so many deal with the same issues. There's so many distractions that try to make you settle before you ever reach the place that you're intending to be. It's time to let go of the baggage and move forward. Don't settle for good enough. You know, there were two tribes of Israel who took their eyes off the vision, and they wanted to settle for good enough. In Numbers 32, we read about the tribes of Reuben and the tribes of Gad. They had very large livestock and were traveling through to the promised land with all the other tribes, but all of a sudden they reached the land of Jazer and the land of Gilead, And when they got there, they wanted to stay there. It looked like a place that was ideal for livestock. And so they came up to Moses and they said, well, can we just stay here? We know we're going on to the promised land, but actually this place looks good enough. Can we stay here? And God's anger was so aroused against them that he said no men over the age of 20 and above would see the land he'd promised to them because they didn't follow him wholeheartedly. You see, they wanted to settle for what was convenient and comfortable, but in doing so, they missed out on what had been promised to them. This year, I was supposed to be doing the 3 Peaks Challenge to raise money for One by One, and we were going to be climbing Snowdon, Ben Nevis and Scafell Pike, which are the highest mountains in England, Scotland and Wales. But unfortunately, before doing the climb, I had a fall, broke my foot quite badly. Ironically, I fell on a step. I don't know what it is about me and steps, but evidently the two don't go well together. And so I badly broke my foot and had to pull out of the mountain climbing trip. But before that, while I was still preparing to do the climb, I'd been doing all this research about mountain climbing, what to wear, what to drink, what to eat, what shoes to wear. Shoes are always the classic. And I'd been doing all this research, and I came across a story. It's about a famous mountain climbing resort in the Swiss Alps, and it caters specifically for businesses that try to encourage their employees to hike up a mountain together. And the goal is to work on camaraderie and teach teamwork. And it's said that it's about an 8-hour trek to the summit. Now, anyone in reasonably good shape can normally ascend to the top with no problem. It's hard work, but they can normally do it. So in the morning, the hikers all gather together at the base of the mountain for their pep talk before starting the climb. And normally the group's really excited. They can't wait to get up the slopes and have a group picture taken together as they celebrate the excitement of the journey that they're about to embark on. And so the hikers have been going at it for several hours before they finally take a break. And approximately halfway up this mountain stands a really quaint alpine restaurant. By now, it's normally around noon in the afternoon, and the weary hikers go into the restaurant and peel off their walking boots and plop down by the fire pit, ready to have a cup of coffee or a hot chocolate and eat their lunch together. They've got the mountain as the backdrop, and the hikers drink their nice, warm, cozy coffee and look at the picturesque setting, and it's all stunning, it's all beautiful. But interestingly, after they're full on their lunch and they're comfortable, they've rested for a while and they're feeling good, fewer than half of the hikers normally continue to do the climb to the top of the mountain. And it isn't because they're not able to do the climb. It's not because suddenly the climb looks far too difficult to be able to do it. It's simply because their reluctance to continue is normally because they're satisfied on where they are. They look out and it's already beautiful. It's already halfway up the mountain, so they can see for miles already. And they're at this beautiful restaurant and they feel rested and they feel relaxed and they've got this lovely cup of coffee in their hands and all is well. Why would you want to bother climbing? Why do you want to put your feet through that? You can rest here. This is good. This is good enough, right? Well, search your heart for a moment. Are we sometimes tempted to settle for what's easy? God has such a destiny for your life. But don't miss out on what he has for you because you're content to settle with your tiny breadcrumb. By contrast, let's look at a character in the Old Testament called Obed-Edom. In 1 Samuel 5, we read about the Ark of the Covenant of God. And this was a wooden chest that's covered in gold, and it contains the 10 Commandments. It was often a symbol of God's presence to the Israelites. Now, this had been captured by the Philistines, and they tried to keep it, and that didn't go quite too well for them as all of a sudden all these sicknesses and tumours started breaking out. They then tried to put it in the room with their god Dagon, but that didn't work out too well either, as every time they walked in, their god was on the floor before the ark. And so eventually King David wants to take back the ark and tries to take it back to Jerusalem. So they build a cart to transport it, and suddenly one of the oxen who's pulling the cart starts to stumble. A man named Uzzah stretches out his hand to try and steady the ark from falling, but as he does that, he's immediately struck dead. So far, it's not going too well. They have to pause the journey of moving the ark. Nothing quite like a dead body to put a halt to the plan. But in 2 Samuel 6, it says this. 2 Samuel 6 and verse 9 says, David was afraid of the Lord that day and said, how can the ark of the Lord come to me? He was not willing to take the ark of the Lord to be with him in the city of David. Instead, he took it to the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite. The ark of the Lord remained in the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite for 3 months, and the Lord blessed him and his entire house. When David hears that the Lord has blessed the house of Obed-Edom, he decides to move the ark back to Jerusalem as he'd originally planned. But that's not where the story ends for Obed-Edom. After the ark, symbolizing the presence of God, has been in his house for 3 months, he knows what it is to have the blessing of God on his life. Suddenly, this is then taken from him. He could have gone away and never been heard of ever again, but he's transformed. He's known the presence of God. Suddenly, from that point on, Obed-Edom appears everywhere. In 1 Chronicles 15, we find that David tells the Levites to appoint their leaders to be musicians amongst them. And so Obed joins up and becomes a musician. Then we continue reading in chapter 15 that they need doorkeepers to help protect the ark. Guess who's there? Obed-Edom. Carry on reading in the next chapter, and now they need more Levites to minister before the ark of the Lord, to extol and thank and praise God. Guess who's there? Obed-Edom. Then we carry on reading a few verses down, and now they need gatekeepers. Guess who's there as a gatekeeper? Obed-Edom, but not just Obed-Edom. Obed-Edom and 68 of his relatives too. What if your passion for Jesus and his presence led to 68 of your friends and family coming to know him too? You see, we have a choice on our journey of life. We can choose to be content with the breadcrumbs and settle like the children of Israel so often did. Or we can decide to be like Obed-Edom, to hunger after his presence, to fall so in love with Jesus that we would do anything to be near where he is. The key is we have to set off from the very place that we're tempted to settle. After I'd built the King's Children's Home, I felt this complete relief, as I felt like I'd fulfilled the will of God. You know, God said to me as a young girl about a children's home, and all of a sudden, 2012, here we are, the King's Children's Home. Now I can suddenly sit back and put my feet up and just enjoy until I reach glory. Except it's not quite like that. You know, the story God has for your life never stops with what he initially tells you at the start. There's always more with him. And so I remember after the King's Children's Home was established, and I was in a time of prayer, and every time I began praying, I suddenly felt a burden for the nation of Sri Lanka. And I would initially try to shake it off, not really getting it, and carry on praying. And again, the nation of Sri Lanka would come to me. This was a nation that I'd never been to. I knew nothing about Sri Lanka. I knew nothing about the area, nothing of what the country had gone through for years. Didn't know anyone from Sri Lanka. And yet every time I began to pray, I felt that nation just burning on me, until eventually I finally caught up and said, okay, God, what do you want me to do in Sri Lanka? And so we actually began to pray about it, myself and my husband together, of, okay, what does God want us to do in Sri Lanka? I knew in my heart it didn't look like orphans, but what do you do in that moment? Do you just book a plane and turn up in the airport and be, hey, I've arrived, here I am, Sri Lanka, the answer to your prayers? You can't just do that. And so I remember saying to God, okay, God, if this really is part of your plan, you need to show me what to do. I have no idea. I don't know anyone from Sri Lanka. I've never been to the nation. You have to show me what to do. It's only a small nation on the map, but it's still a big place, and I didn't know where to start. And so I remember we'd been booked in to speak at a church in America. And just before going there, they called us and said, I'm so sorry, we've double booked you. We were supposed to be speaking at this Friday night service, and they double booked us with someone. And we said, don't worry, we're in relationship with this church anyway, so we just enjoy going and being a part of it. So we said, don't worry, we'll come anyway. And so we arrive at this church on the Friday night, and it just so happened that the person they double booked us with was a man from Sri Lanka who has this huge church right in Colombo in Sri Lanka. I began to share my heart with him how God had been prompting us to go to that nation and do something. And that very next day we went to breakfast with him, and within a few months I'm sat in his house in Sri Lanka as God had opened a door that I never could. Now we do this incredible work where we're helping widows right in the very northern tip of Sri Lanka where the war was so brutal. We're helping them through a feeding program, and many women who were once Buddhists and Hindus have now given their hearts and lives to Christ because of this feeding program. We're going on and opening up sewing centres throughout the nation of Sri Lanka, so trying to give independence back to these widows. But it only happened because God placed it on our heart, and we continue to keep saying yes. It's not a yes once and for all, it's a continual process of what God wants to reveal. See, God only ever reveals a small part of the plan for our lives. Maybe if he revealed the whole plan to us, we'd probably just freak out. Either that or we'd try and run ahead of him and try and figure it our way and try and help God out. But he only reveals a part at a time so that we walk in dependency and humility with him. Colossians 4 is a beautiful scripture in verse 12, and it says, he is always wrestling in prayer for you, that you might stand perfect and complete in all the will of God. Do you want to fulfill all the will of God, or just a part? See, to fulfill all that he has for you, you have to set off from the very place that you're tempted to settle. Don't let the good overtake the best that God has for your life. It's not about earning or striving, but it's about longing for more of God in our lives. And it's from that deep place of intimacy that the will of God can begin to unfold in our lives. Never lose your wonder or your hunger for who God is, but be like Obed-Edom, who longed for his presence and longed for more. When we grasp this truth, we will really begin to flourish, not just living for him, but living with him. You know, I hope you've enjoyed this series with me. Please keep in touch, get in touch with me on social media, or keep in touch with me and let me know if something throughout this series has touched your life or helped you in some way. I pray that whatever stage of life you find yourself in, that you'll be able to embrace the journey God has you on. Don't rush to the destination that you think you're intended to be at, but embrace your everyday journey with God. I pray that it's blessed you. It's been a joy to be with you. God bless.